Lawyers of Reddit, what are your wildest case stories? Asked my brother, an attorney for the bus system in Detroit. This is his answer. We had someone on one of the buses start breastfeeding during the ride. Someone must have brought it to the attention of the driver, who then directed the lady to put that titty away. She refused, and he eventually stopped the bus and told her to get off, which she didn't. The police got involved. After the media got hold of the story, my brother goes to work to find roughly 100 women outside the building to his offices, all openly breastfeeding their babies. Had an arbitration case for a guy who was fired from his job in a packing plant for masturbating in the shower. He worked maintenance, and his shift ended at an odd time compared to the 300 or so line workers. He was having a shower and rubbing one out, thinking he would be all alone, when the line broke down and there was a general break. A dozen people walked into the locker room together and caught him. He was reported to HR and terminated. In the hearing, I had him on the stand, and he told the panel that he was simply washing his penis. On cross, he admitted that he was washing it vigorously, and for a substantial period of times. On redirect, I asked him if he was washing it for longer than he normally does at home. He said no. Then, spontaneously, he got angry and said, "It's my penis and my soap, and I'll wash it as fast as I want." He was reinstated with back pay. True story, criminal law, as told by one of my professors, to exemplify the seriousness of not letting your client speak, or do anything for that matter. Long story short, the defendant was on trial for murder. The only piece of evidence left at the scene were a pair of sunglasses. There wasn't enough evidence to convict the defendant of murder, so the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. After the trial was over, the defense attorney went to talk to the press and left the defendant sitting at his table. After being relieved of hearing his not guilty verdict, he went up to the judge and asked him how he can get his sunglasses back. One of my dad's friends told me this story. When he was in law school, he sat in on a case where a man had been pulled over with several pounds of marijuana. He was being charged with possession and intent to distribute. He pleaded guilty to possession, but said that he was planning to stay half-baked for 6 months straight and was not a dealer. At the beginning of the hearing, the judge, the prosecution, and the jury were bemused at the seemingly ridiculous idea. It turns out that the guy had prepaid his rent, cable, internet, electricity bills, etc. For 6 months, had about 6 months' worth of canned and preserved food in his apartment, and had quit his job just prior to being arrested. Partway through, the judge stops the trial, turns to the jury and says, "I'm convinced any of you still think he's guilty?" No one said anything, and the jury was allowed to officially deliberate, which took less than a minute, and the guy got off for the intent to distribute charges. Represented a DUI client who swore up and down to me he hadn't been drinking or doing any drugs. Newbie officer who had his field training officer with him in the car. Rookie pulls client over for a tag violation, walks back to the car with body camera still on. Training officer says, "Get him out for a DUI," and the rookie says, "But he's not intoxicated," to which the reply was, "Do it anyway." Body cam clicks off, turns on 7 minutes later, and they're doing field sobriety exercises on my client. Client sat in custody for 3 weeks, until I finally got the tape from the prosecutor and presented it to the judge. The "oh shit" looks from the prosecutor and FTO when the judge saw the tape. I'll treasure that one. Judge wrote the police chief a letter saying the FTO was dead to him, and he'd deny every search warrant he tried to bring thereafter for being a liar. Client is hopefully still on track with his civil attorney in a lawsuit. This didn't happen to me, but there was this lawyer who really needed to take a shit, so he asked the judge for a recess. Judge refused because he wanted to get the trial done that day. The lawyer was getting really antsy, begging for even 5 minutes. Judge shot him down. After a little while, this horrific stench begins to waft through the courtroom. The jury detects it first, then opposing counsel. Soon the judge clears out the courtroom and declares a mistrial. The lawyer in question had just shit his pants. He just sat there while the courtroom was cleared. The judge apparently had to declare a mistrial. I had client whose $60K car was ruined by a shop that put in the wrong oil. We couldn't prove it at first. The engine blew up, oil leaked out, and evidence was lost. I subpoenaed their bank records, figured out they bought their oil from Costco. Called Costco, and got their prices for the last 2 years. I then worked out the amounts they were spending, did some backhand math, and showed based on the values it was impossible they had ever bought the right oil. They settled in full immediately. This is so petty, I've had much bigger moments, but because of the character of the other side, this will always be my favorite. Doing a boundary dispute, a squabble over what was essentially a few inches of land. OS was a lawyer, and an absolute arsehole. He was acting for himself. The whole a lawyer who acts for himself has a fool for a client thing was bang on for him. But he was a deeply unpleasant guy, a bully, who thought that he was the smartest guy in the room. Part of his case hinged on wheelie bins and how prior to the boundary having been moved, there wasn't space to store a full-size bin beside the house. The fact you now could meant clearly the boundary must have moved. That was the extent of his evidence. It really was thin stuff. During the actual trial, he pulled a fast one by suddenly producing an old aerial photo, ostensibly to show the boundary at the front of the property had also moved. A fast one because you have to disclose stuff like that in advance. You can't just sit on something relevant and then suddenly whip it out at trial with a flourish. Whilst he was making his submissions that it should be admissible, I looked more closely at it, away from the bit of the boundary he said it was relevant to, and realized that it very clearly showed a wheelie bin in exactly the spot his case said there couldn't be one. Told the judge we were happy for the photo to be admitted after all, got the other side to confirm the date it was taken, then pointed out he'd just completely fucked his case. That photo did him for nearly $50,000 in adverse costs. Couldn't happen to a more deserving chap. My client was a woman working at a meat packing plant. Her glove, they would only give her the loose kind because they were cheaper, got caught in the machine and she lost her arm. We sued the owners of the plant for the glove issue. We also sued the machine manufacturer for failing to include the required guard. Then we sued the distributor for being in the chain of the sale, but didn't really think they played much of a role. The manufacturer swore they included a handguard and said the plant owner must have used a grinder to take it off. During a deposition of the guy that owned the distraction company, he shows up with the sale documents he was supposed to have turned over weeks before. Turns out, there was a note in small print at the bottom he didn't know about that, said the sale was without the handguard, which is against the law. I pointed it out, and we ended up settling that afternoon with the distributor. The woman got all her medical bills paid, got money for a prosthetic, and got a bunch of pain and suffering damages. Not a lawyer. Was taking my ex to court over custody of my kid. I had compiled a 150-page dossier, complete with a report from Child Protective Services, since there was abuse in the household, text messages and tons of records of contempt of our previous agreement. My daughter has a court-assigned lawyer that is normal in these cases, which after reading through all the materials and talking to all the parties sided with my lawyer and I. The ex decided to represent themselves because, hubris, I suppose. Before the case was heard in the hallway outside of the courtroom, she gave me an agreement she typed up, which would grant me custody, as well as some generous provisions for herself. I politely declined, as we were confident we would be getting a lot more in trail. Case was called. Testimonies in. She put on the most hilariously insane and embarrassing show for the court. In her closing testimony, she attempted to hand the judge the agreement she tried to give us. Judge refused to take it. You can't just hand me things. That's not how you submit things into evidence. I'm not reading that. She's arguing with the judge, yelling at him, and losing her shit. In the insane nonsense she was spewing, she said. And this agreement gives him custody, which is one of the things he's after. In what I assume was an attempt to show that she's attempting a compromise. My lawyer peppers in a quick statement. Okay, so you agree for the father to have full custody. She snaps in heated anger. Yes, that's what I agreed to. Our side falls completely silent, and the judge, after much effort, ends her little outburst. Gave his final verdict, which started with granting me custody and putting her in court-mandated therapy. She literally gave away custody of her daughter in a heated argument with the judge. I was representing Mom in a bitter custody fight. Dad wanted full custody and argued Mom was an unfit parent. Mom wanted full custody because Dad had a history of domestic violence towards her and the kids. Dad's lawyer was doing a good job of painting her in a bad light during his cross-examination, and I was starting to get worried. His lawyer brought a close family friend as a character witness for Dad, who said the usual nice things about Dad. Then he said something about them owning chickens. I thought that was odd, so I asked more questions. I was able to get the friend to spill the beans that the dad owned chickens for illegal cockfighting, and he'd take his minor children to these cockfights. And when the children were acting up, he'd punish them by forcing them to feed the chickens, during which they would get pecked and scratched by the chickens. And obviously, the children were terrified of those chickens. I could see the color draining from Dad's lawyer's face. Mom got full custody. Told a judge to shove his threats up his arse and pay my client. The judge paid my client. While doing SSA disability hearings a few years ago, I represented a guy in a case that was back on remand from federal court. Long story short, the original administrative law judge, ALJ, didn't follow the correct procedure and denied the guy because he could return to his last work, Step 4. Basically, he was granted a partially favorable decision that gave him $700 a month rather than the $2,100 he should have received. The ALJs are notoriously assholes and try to scare people out of pursuing claims. This judge apparently thought he could intimidate me and my client into withdrawing the appeal by threatening to take away all the guy's benefits. Little did he know, I'm not a moron, and I hate bullies. He started the hearing by asking my client if he was aware that he could take all his benefits away. Asking if your counsel has informed you that, by continuing this hearing, you may lose all benefits and owe all amounts back to the agency as an overpayment. This was completely impossible because 6 years had gone by since the original decision, and the judge could only reopen the decision within 2 years. The guy was bulletproof on this issue. Also, the job he previously did, computer system installer, was completely obsolete and physically impossible since his physical problems prevented him from lifting more than 20 pounds, and the computer he was installing during the 1980s were 50 to 150 pounds. The judge didn't think about that and clearly didn't read the federal court remand notice. So, long story short, the judge says to me, "Counsel, have you done your ethical duty and advised your client that he could lose all his benefits today?" To which I responded by looking at my client and in a full voice saying he can't do that. Then, without missing a beat, looked back at the judge and said, "Your Honor, I have advised my client that you cannot take his benefits away." I told the judge we would waive all other procedural portions of the hearings and proceed directly to vocational expert testimony. I asked the vocational expert 2 questions. Would the prior job require lifting more than 20 lbs? And has the prior job existed as performed since 1999? She quickly answered no to both questions, and then on her own elaborated all the reasons why. Total hearing was 6 minutes long. The judge had no choice but to grant the original application, and the guy got $158,000 in unpaid benefits and $1,400 a month more than he had been receiving. He broke down into tears and said he could finally keep the promise to his wife to return her ashes to the beach they got married on in Hawaii. A dream he had years ago decided would be impossible. Best day of my career, so far. I served on a jury that was deciding a medical malpractice case. The plaintiff's common bile duct was cut during a gallbladder surgery, a risk she was made aware of beforehand. She was suing the surgeon who performed the operation. The plaintiff's lawyer called as a witness a surgeon who had performed this surgery thousands of times. Speaking from this breadth of experience, he told us this mistake was entirely unacceptable and something that no competent surgeon would do. The defense lawyer got up and grilled him for a while to make it clear that this guy made bank by traveling around the country testifying against other surgeons. Right before he sat down, the defense lawyer said, "By the way, have you ever cut the common bile duct during this surgery?" The case was decided, and the jury all but burst out laughing when he answered, "Yes, I have." Husband and wife charged with drug sales. Wife had given a full admission to the cops and ended up pleading before trial. The drugs were found in a shed with tools that the husband admits are his, but he denies knowing anything about the drugs. I go to trial against husband, and during his testimony, he says something about traditional family values. On cross, I start asking about his relationship with his wife. He admits that he's in charge of the finances, admits she has to ask permission to spend money. He ends up saying that she doesn't do anything without his permission. I then ask him if he knows she admitted to selling drugs. He did. So wouldn't she need his permission to do that? Of course she would, he says. No further questions. Jury comes back guilty in less than half an hour. That's it for this video. Be sure to give it a like and subscribe to Reddit Stories Online for more Reddit stories, and we'll see you next time.